what are you really seeing? Riots in Burkina Faso, in Mozambique, in Mauritania, and in other countries because people are hungry.
Now I can buy the rice because the price have gone up.
Gordon Brown challenges world governments to solve the global food crisis.
It's difficult. Even food,
the very poor have suffered.
In the riots, people have died.
It's big news these days. Rapidly rising food prices along with social turmoil as communities feel the impact and look for ways to express their anger and frustration. But hunger and poverty are nothing new to Southern Africa. Despite efforts to meet the Millennium Development Goal of halving poverty, nearly 300 million Africans are living on less than $1 a day. Unlike anywhere else in the world, poverty is not only increasing, but is also intensifying in Africa. And today, the continent is home to 3/4 of the world's ultra-poor, those who somehow manage to exist on less than 50 US cents a day. The traditional response to hunger in Southern Africa has been to treat it as an emergency and to provide food aid. Food aid keeps people alive, but doesn't do much more than that. It doesn't reduce future vulnerability to poverty and hunger, or help people improve their situation. But things are changing. There's growing recognition that poverty and hunger are predictable problems, needing long-term, predictable solutions. Governments, NGOs, and international donors have started looking at long-term, predictable social transfer programs as a way to fight chronic poverty. Social transfers can take the form of cash, food, agricultural input like seeds or fertilizer, assets like livestock or tools, or some sort of combination of these. But more and more, the attention is on cash transfers.
The term social protection might be new, but it's not a new concept in Africa. In fact, there's a long tradition in African societies of people looking after each other, of mutual support. For example, the chief would set aside a field which would be used for the benefit of people in the village that couldn't farm for themselves. Of course, you have remittances, people living in town sending money back to their parents. A lot of other systems like that. There's a long tradition of this kind of support. But of course, nowadays we find a lot of pressure on these informal systems. You know, the impact of HIV and AIDS, for example, has been devastating. Urbanization and other social changes, families becoming more nuclear, commercialization, all of these things have meant that the traditional community support systems have more or less broken down in many places or cannot cope with these new pressures. And that's where the state has to play a bigger role. And nowadays we're increasingly recognizing that the state has to take up the responsibility of providing social protection to its most needy and poorest citizens.
In March 2006, in Livingstone, Zambia, senior government representatives from 13 African countries signed the Livingstone Call for Action. The Livingstone Declaration recognizes that social protection is a right, but it goes further and asks African governments to come up with plans and budgets for their own national social protection programs. While some countries have started to make progress on this, it has often been slow, and in spite of what the Livingstone Declaration says, the idea of social transfers, and particularly cash transfers, is still controversial in some quarters.
Would it not perhaps be better to, instead of giving people cash, introducing food schemes at schools and, say, at universities from that same money? Because then
there is a lot of skepticism about social transfers, and especially about the idea of giving cash to poor people. And curiously, a lot of this skepticism comes from very rich countries which have very expensive and highly sophisticated social security systems of their own. For example, the UK gives about a third of its budget every year to social protection programs. But the idea of giving cash to poor people is often associated with dependency and the argument that the money will be wasted.
Why is it that people who are otherwise quite rational and sensible really, really worry about grants causing teenage pregnancy? That's with respect to the child support grant. Or the old age pension causing people to leave work.
And if you could also say something, perhaps, if there's any evidence which says whether a lot of this money is spent on gambling, lotto, that kind of thing.
There's an assumption there that poor people, or particularly people on the lowest 20% of society, like the lives that they lead. That if they had an opportunity to get out, that they don't want to get out. Now, I haven't found any research that actually proves this. It's based on a set of anecdotal information. Somebody drives through some rural area, sees somebody drunk and says, well, people in rural areas like to be drunk and therefore they don't want to get out. Now, there is a significant amount of evidence, other forms of evidence that point to people trying their utmost to get out of the mess that they are. If you just look at the amount of sacrifices that rural communities make to get children into university, it suggests that there is a real desire to get out of the system.
We have anecdotal stories, of course. You always hear about one or two people that have gone off and misused the money. But on balance, the evidence is that people use money very responsibly.
We need to be serious instead of playing around with people's lives just because they are poor and we think they can be in control of their lives. We have to let people be in control of their lives. And that's what made the Western world successful, because they had social security. They had social protection.
So, are social transfers effective, or are they a waste of money and a burden on the state? To find out, we can turn to the evidence coming out of a number of existing projects and programs. In Zambia, 2004 saw the start of a series of pilot projects providing cash transfers to the poorest of the poor, first in Kalomo district and then extended to 4 others: Kazungula, Monze, Katete, and Chipata.
Chipata was found to be one of the districts that was highly affected by poverty, where over 20% of the population were living under or below the poverty datum line. The district in the recent years is seen to be growing gradually. As you enter the district, actually you see people are investing now into building their own houses. There are also small industries that are, mushrooming in the town. But at the same time, again, we are seeing the poverty levels increasing because of some people who are not able to engage themselves into production. So this is where actually we begin to see some households, some individuals being vulnerable.
Kukacha kuseni nupyanga nikapyanga.
In the morning, the first thing I do is to sweep the surrounding. I also sweep my house, then I go to draw water from the well. From there, I prepare food for the school-going children. I prepare porridge for them. And after they have eaten, they go to school. Then I also go to the field where I do some farming. Then in the evening, also I prepare food for the children so that they have supper.
The pilot cash transfer scheme in Chipata is implemented by Zambia's Public Welfare Assistance Scheme with the assistance of CARE International. The scheme works with local community welfare assistance committees, or QACs. These are made up of volunteers living within the areas. The QACs help to identify the beneficiaries of the scheme, those who are poorest and most vulnerable within the community.
When I receive the transfer, the first thing I do is to buy 2 bags of maize, which I take to the hammer mills to grind into meal. Then I also look into the needs of the children who are going to school. This involves buying books, buying uniforms, and any other fees that the school may be asking for.
Well, the benefits of giving people cash is that they know what to do. Because if I have a problem with school going chaps and then somebody comes in and gives me food, we'll eat, but they want to go to school. But then if I'm given cash, we'll budget, we'll share some money to school and a bit of some food. Yes.
The Chipata pilot illustrates some of the benefits of cash transfers. Beneficiaries have been able to improve their levels of nutrition. Self-esteem improves as people are able to pay back loans and invest in assets. And education levels increase as families can afford to keep children in school. The Chipata scheme, in fact, includes a bonus to assist those with school-going children.
I still see so many people that when I look at them, I feel pity. But registration was only done once, and we cannot add any more beneficiaries.
When we started interacting with the beneficiaries, it was very clear that these people were living on begging. Begging from neighbors, begging from streets, begging from shops as a way of earning a livelihood. Most of the children that they are keeping were not going to school because the parents could not afford, and also because there was no food that the children should go happily at school. Also, children were involved in trading because they could do anything that could help them earn a living. With the coming of the social cash transfer, we have seen actually an increased number of these children who are involved in training going back to school. Their uniforms are in good condition. Some of them who didn't have uniforms, now they have uniforms. They look cleaner. Their faces also look bright. That's one thing that you can see as you interact with them. The parents also look very confident as you interact with them. We find they are so confident, actually.
Many have actually resorted to investing that money into farming by buying a bit of some fertilizers so that people can help them do the farming for future use.
In Mozambique, since 1997, the government has been implementing the PSA Food Subsidy Program, which is in fact a cash transfer program. This program is operated by the National Institute for Social Action under the Ministry of Women and Social Action.
Em Moçambique, nós temos a proteção social como uma das prioridades para a redução da pobreza em toda a nossa sociedade. Por isso é que o governo aprovou, levou à Assembleia da República e foi aprovada a Lei de Proteção Social.
The PSA in Mozambique has over 100,000 beneficiaries. These people are identified within the community by volunteers called permanentes.
Como que esses beneficiários são identificados? O permanente, que é selecionado pelas estruturas do próprio bairro, e de confiança da própria estrutura local, tem a tarefa de fazer aquilo que chamamos de visitas domiciliares, onde de casa em casa vai procurar a informação daqueles que nós consideramos os potenciais beneficiários, que são os idosos, os portadores de deficiência, os doentes crônicos, entre outros que devem ser assistidos pelo programa Subsídio de Alimento.
Aleliya ndzi nyikiwaka mfumo ndzi xava swakudya organic ku ndzi pfuneta ringana lomu masin'wini leswaku masin'wini ka kona a ku na nchumu loko i malembe lawa ku nga ni swakudya yi na ku mpfula swa huma swifaki ku swa hi le kuma ma mpfula yini.
The Lesotho Old Age Pension is an example of a national program with universal coverage. In 2004, Lesotho's finance minister introduced an old age pension for all citizens over 70 years old.
We are now transferring on a monthly basis an amount of about 15 million maluti, which is equivalent of 15 million rands. There is no external funding, it is purely from domestic resources. When we started in November 2004, we had about 64,000 old age pensioners. But currently they have now increased to 77,000.
What am I guy?
72.
If it didn't want me,
150.
150. By the two America,
200.
The introduction of the old age pension in Lesotho went against advice from donor countries and the international financial institutions. They said Lesotho couldn't afford to introduce a pension and that it didn't make economic sense. But today, 4 years down the line, the Lesotho old age pension is seen as a success, although at 70, the age for eligibility is high. While the number of individual beneficiaries may be small, research shows that a quarter of all households actually benefit from the pension. Research from Lesotho again shows that when poor people receive cash, they tend to spend it on food and other necessities such as healthcare. The examples from Lesotho, Mozambique, and Zambia illustrate that social transfers are effective in assisting the poor and vulnerable. But does the evidence from these countries address the most common criticisms of social transfers, and cash transfers in particular?
The evidence from case studies of social transfer programs across Africa is overwhelmingly positive. Firstly, of course, if you give poor people money, they are better off. So their income rises and their poverty level reduces. Often people invest some of this money. They don't just consume it, although that's important. You know, they meet their basic needs. They buy food and groceries and clothing and so on. But they also invest some of this money in education for their children or in their own health or in farming. They buy seeds and fertilizer. So poverty levels can reduce both directly and indirectly. We find evidence, for example, that where you've got very big social pension schemes, as in South Africa, that children in households where there is a pensioner are actually taller than children who don't have pensioners supporting them.
One really important study shows that it raises where the pension goes to an older woman, and there's a huge big gender difference there. Where the pension goes to an older woman, it raises the nutritional status as measured, the nutritional state of household members. So it's not saying that old people saying we give it to the family. It's actually measured nutritional status, and particularly of young children, which is important.
We find that there is very powerful evidence that cash transfers in particular generate economic multipliers.
People are taking these grants and they're buying something with these grants, and then they sell that thing. And then they translate a 700 or 800 grant to 12 or 13 or 1400.
And this economic multiplier effect has benefits for trade and for employment and for income generation throughout the economy. So you can imagine that if you multiply that up, if you have a large-scale program over the entire economy running for a long time, that you're going to get economic growth impacts, and the evidence for this is starting to build up, and that over time, eventually, less people would be in poverty, less people would need social protection, and so the government would need to spend less on social protection in the long run than it does have to do initially.
There are two crucial questions to be resolved. Who should benefit from social transfer programs, and how will governments pay for them?
Targeting is one of the longest running debates in social protection. Should we give social transfers to the poorest of the poor, or to vulnerable groups who are identifiably vulnerable because they are old or very young, or they have a disability, or they're chronically ill? It's very difficult to identify who the poorest of the poor actually are, especially if you're talking about communities where there's widespread poverty. If instead you were to identify groups of people who are clearly vulnerable and that the community accepts as being vulnerable, and you target your transfers at those groups, you're more likely to get a big impact because it's going to be well targeted, and also you're going to get more social acceptance of that targeting criterion. So pensions to the older person are a very popular and deservedly so form of targeting. Similarly, providing child support grants or support to young children or people who are chronically ill. These are categories of people that everybody accepts are vulnerable. The question of whether social protection is affordable or not is often raised, but this is really a political choice rather than a technical one. Governments can choose how to spend their money, and they do. If they choose to prioritize social protection, they'll go ahead and do it.
Shouldn't we not be simply thinking about how to pay for it? Shouldn't we be thinking about how to rechange the spending priorities of the state?
It's not true that governments cannot afford social protection. We can cut down on unnecessary expenditures and take care of the poor. And then, only then, that day, we will say we have joined the global race.
As the saying goes, where there's a will, there's a way. Despite all the positive evidence, some governments are reluctant to begin implementing social protection. In such cases, ordinary citizens and civil society organizations have an important role to play in persuading policymakers that social transfers are a priority. In other words, in building political will for social protection.
Do we want to? That's the question. It's not about resources, it's about the willpower. Do we want to?
Once the government has committed to introduce some form of social protection, it's very difficult to reverse that. And it becomes something that civil society can mobilize around. For instance, in Lesotho, we are now seeing efforts to lower the age of eligibility from 70 down to 65 or 60. In South Africa, the child support grant is the subject of a campaign to raise the age from 14 to 16 and then later on to 18.
What works is we start with debates. We start with a lot of media. You expose the thing and exactly how, why we need social protection. You then start making petitions. You can even jump petitions to demonstrations. You mobilize the community into fighting for their rights. Because if they don't, what will happen? Something comes up from the blues, like xenophobia. When the poor have had enough, they can do anything.
With poverty making headlines and world leaders worried about the link between hunger and social instability, perhaps the real question facing us all is not whether social protection is affordable, but rather, what is the cost of not putting social protection programs in place?
Prevention may look expensive, but believe it, it's much cheaper than actually having to deal with catastrophes.
If you actually do not do this, there are some serious consequences to that. We can have the most wonderful initiatives, but we might have serious disruptions at the political level that destroy all our futures. And that's something that we need to start thinking about.
In Africa, it seems we're not yet convinced. And so we're endlessly running new pilots to try and find more lessons that we can learn, when in fact the lessons are there and they're very clear and they're unambiguously positive. So I think although pilots have had a very big impact in terms of telling us how to do social protection well, it's time to move away from pilots and to move up to the next challenge, which is nationally run, government-owned, citizen-driven social protection.
I would really request that the government continues to run a program like this, because people like me are really poor and we have no means of survival. And the children that we are keeping need to go to school.
Social protection imatateza magulu asakwere mbuna ya umpawi. Social protection kupata antu inumpawu zoti azitetezere. Social protection kupata antu inumpawu zokonyeza umpawi wawo. Social protection imayanganira magulu antu sauka. Social protection imateteza magulu asakwere mbuna ya umpawi. Social protection kupata antu inumpawu zoti azitetezere. Social protection kupata antu inumpawu zokonyeza umpawi wawo. Social protection